The wind howled through the Colorado mountains like a banshee, carrying with it the promise of death. Bernadette Martinez pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she navigated the treacherous path leading to the old Silverbrook mine. What she would find in those depths would change 3 lives forever and bring face to face with a man whose name was whispered in fear across 5 states. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Bernadette had been a social worker in the mountain towns of Colorado for nearly 15 years, but she'd never received a call quite like this one. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Jake Morrison, a grizzled prospector who still believed there was gold left in these hills. "Ma'am, I found something up at the old Silverbrook that ain't right," Jake's voice crackled through. The poor connection. "Kids, I think. 2 of them. They're in a bad way." The drive to the abandoned mine took Bernadette through winding mountain roads that hadn't seen proper maintenance in decades. Snow began to fall as she climbed higher into the Rockies, each flake adding to the already treacherous conditions. The Silverbrook mine had been closed since 1987, when a cave-in killed 3 workers, and the company decided the remaining ore wasn't worth the legal battles. Jake was waiting for her at the mine entrance, his weathered face grave with concern. At 68, he'd seen plenty in these mountains, but whatever was in that mine had shaken him. "They're about 50 yards in one of the old storage chambers," he said, handing her a powerful flashlight. "I was checking for structural damage when I heard crying. Thought it was just the wind at first, but the wind don't cry for its mama." The mine entrance yawned before them like the mouth of some ancient beast. Bernadette had investigated child welfare cases in difficult places before, crack houses, abandoned buildings, even a few caves, but there was something particularly unsettling about descending into the earth itself. The wooden support beams groaned as they made their way deeper into the mine. The air grew colder with each step, and their breath formed visible clouds in the beam of the flashlight. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere in the darkness, creating an eerie rhythm that seemed to count down the seconds. "Just up ahead," Jake whispered. Though there was no need for quiet in the empty mine, the storage chamber had once held equipment and supplies for the mining operation. Now it contained 2 small figures huddled together on a pile of old canvas tarps. Bernadette's heart clenched as her flashlight beam fell upon them. The twins couldn't have been more than 4 years old. A boy and a girl, both with dark hair and pale skin that had taken on an alarming bluish tinge from the cold. They were dressed in clothes that had once been warm, thick sweaters and sturdy pants, but everything was damp from the mine's moisture, making their situation even more dire. The little girl was awake, her large brown eyes reflecting the flashlight beam like a frightened animal's. She had her arms wrapped protectively around her brother, who appeared to be unconscious or in a deep, concerning sleep. Both children were shivering violently. "Hey there, sweetheart," Bernadette said softly, setting down her flashlight and slowly approaching the children. "My name is Bernadette. I'm here to help you." The girl didn't respond verbally, but she pulled her brother closer, as if expecting Bernadette to try to separate them. Up close, Bernadette could see that both children were severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure. The boy's lips were nearly blue, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. "What are your names?" Bernadette asked gently, removing her own coat and wrapping it around both children. "Emma," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is Ethan. He won't wake up." Bernadette's training kicked in immediately. These children needed medical attention, and they needed it fast. But she also knew that moving them too quickly or in the wrong way could be dangerous in their current state. "Emma, that's a beautiful name," Bernadette said, pulling out her phone to call for emergency medical assistance. Of course, there was no signal in the mine. "How long have you and Ethan been here?" "I don't know," Emma replied, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "Daddy brought us here and said to wait. He said he'd come back, but it's been so long. And Ethan got sick." Jake had been standing silently behind Bernadette, but now he knelt down beside them. "We need to get them out of here right now," he said quietly. "That boy doesn't look good." Bernadette nodded, carefully scooping Ethan into her arms. The child was frighteningly light, and his skin felt like ice. Emma immediately began crying harder when she saw her brother being moved. "I'm not taking him away from you, Emma," Bernadette assured her. "We're all going together. Can you walk?" Emma nodded, though her legs were shaky as she stood. Jake took her hand to steady her, and together the unlikely group began the journey back toward daylight. The trip out of the mine felt longer than the trip in, with every step carefully measured to avoid jostling Ethan too much. Emma stumbled several times, and Jake eventually picked her up, carrying her while Bernadette focused on the unconscious boy. When they finally emerged from the mine, the contrast between the darkness they'd left and the grey winter day felt almost blinding. Bernadette immediately called 911, and within minutes she could hear the distant sound of sirens echoing through the mountains. The paramedics arrived in an ambulance that had seen better days, but the crew was experienced with mountain rescues. They immediately began working on both children, starting IVs and wrapping them in heated blankets. "We need to get them to Denver General," the lead paramedic told Bernadette. "They're both severely hypothermic and dehydrated. The boy is in critical condition." As they loaded the children into the ambulance, Emma grabbed Bernadette's hand with surprising strength for someone in her condition. "You have to tell Daddy where we are," she said urgently. "He'll be looking for us. He always comes." "Back." Bernadette squeezed the little girl's hand. "What's your daddy's name, Emma?" For a moment, Emma hesitated, as if she'd been taught not to answer that question. Then, in a voice so quiet Bernadette had to strain to hear it, she whispered, "Samuel Blackwood." The name hit Bernadette like a physical blow. Samuel Blackwood wasn't just any father looking for his children. He was one of the most wanted men in the western United States, a bank robber and gunman whose exploits had made headlines from Colorado to California. The FBI had been hunting him for over 2 years, and the reward for information leading to his capture was substantial. But looking at Emma's frightened face and Ethan's still form, all Bernadette could think about was that these were children who needed help, regardless of who their father was. The ambulance pulled away, carrying the twins toward Denver and the medical care they desperately needed. Bernadette followed in her own car, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd just learned. Samuel Blackwood had a reputation that went beyond simple bank robbery. He was known for his intelligence, his ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement, and his complete ruthlessness when cornered. Some said he'd killed at least 3 people during his various heists, though the evidence was circumstantial. But he was also known for something else. He worked alone, always. The idea that he had children, let alone that he would abandon them, in an abandoned mine, didn't fit with anything in his criminal profile. As Bernadette drove through the winding mountain roads toward Denver, she found herself wondering what circumstances could have led to Samuel Blackwood leaving his children in such a dangerous place. Had he been injured, captured, or was this part of some larger plan that she couldn't yet see? At Denver General Hospital, the twins were immediately rushed into the emergency room. Bernadette paced the waiting area, trying to process everything that had happened. She'd called her supervisor to report the situation, carefully omitting the detail about their father's identity until she could figure out what to do with that information. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, emerged from the emergency room after what felt like hours, but had probably been less than one. "The children are stable," she reported. "Severe hypothermia and dehydration, but we caught it in time. The boy Ethan was closer to critical than his sister, but he's responding well to treatment. They're both going to need several days of observation and recovery. Relief flooded through Bernadette, followed immediately by the weight of the decision she now faced. She had to report Samuel Blackwood's connection to the children. It was her legal and professional obligation, but she also couldn't shake Emma's words about her father always coming back. "Doctor, do the children have any other injuries?" Bernadette asked. "Anything that might suggest abuse or neglect?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "Actually, quite the opposite. Despite their recent ordeal, both children show signs of having been well cared for. Good nutrition, proper dental care, current vaccinations. Someone has been taking very good care of these kids." This information only added to the mystery. How could one of the most wanted criminals in the country be providing such good care for his children, while simultaneously living a life on the run? That evening, as Bernadette sat beside Emma's hospital bed, the little girl finally opened up about their father. Her description of Samuel Blackwood bore little resemblance to the ruthless criminal depicted in FBI wanted posters. "Daddy reads to us every night," Emma said, her voice still weak but clearer than it had been in the mine. "He knows lots of stories about princes and dragons, and he makes the best pancakes in the whole world." "Where do you and Ethan live with your daddy?" Bernadette asked gently. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Different places," Emma replied. "Daddy says we're on an adventure, and adventures mean you get to see lots of different places. Sometimes we stay in cabins, sometimes in hotels. Once we lived in a really big house with a swimming pool, but we had to leave because Daddy said the adventure was taking us somewhere new." The picture Emma painted was of a father who, despite his criminal activities, had tried to create some semblance of a normal childhood for his twins. But it also raised disturbing questions about how long this adventure had been going on and what kind of life these children had really been living. "Emma, do you remember why Daddy brought you to the mine?" Bernadette asked, the little girl's face scrunched up in concentration. "He was scared about something. There were men looking for us, and Daddy said we needed to hide for a little while. He gave us food and water and said he'd come back before we ran out. How long ago was that? I don't know. It was still dark when he left, and then it got light, and then dark again, and then light again. Maybe 3 times. 3 days. Samuel Blackwood had left his 4-year-old children alone in an abandoned mine for 3 days. Either something had gone very wrong with his plans, or his desperation had driven him to make an uncharacteristically reckless decision. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Bernadette made her choice. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the FBI field office in Denver. Whatever Samuel Blackwood had done, whatever crimes he'd committed, his children deserved protection and care. But she also knew that his capture was inevitable, and when it happened, she wanted to be in a position to advocate for Emma and Ethan. Special Agent Marcus Thompson answered on the second ring. Bernadette had worked with him before on cases involving children and fugitive parents. He was one of the few FBI agents she trusted to handle a situation like this with the sensitivity it required. "Marcus, it's Bernadette Martinez. I have information about Samuel Blackwood." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The bank robber? What kind of information?" "I have his children." Special Agent Marcus Thompson arrived at Denver General Hospital within 2 hours of Bernadette's call, accompanied by Agent Lisa Rodriguez from the Behavioral Analysis Unit. The federal building had been buzzing with activity since the news broke. Samuel Blackwood's children were in custody, which meant the elusive outlaw might finally surface. Thompson found Bernadette in the hospital cafeteria, nursing her 3rd cup of coffee since the ordeal began. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of a woman who hadn't slept, but her posture remained alert and determined. "Tell me everything," Thompson said, sliding into the seat across from her. Bernadette recounted the events at the mine, carefully omitting nothing. She described Emma's condition, Ethan's near-death state, and most importantly, Emma's unwavering belief that her father would return for them. "The girl is convinced he's coming back," Bernadette emphasized. This wasn't abandonment in her mind. It was a temporary separation. She talks about him like he's some kind of hero. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward, her pen poised over a notebook. What exactly did she say about their living situation? Constant movement, different locations, always. Framed as an adventure. But here's the thing, these kids have been well cared for. The doctor confirmed it. Good nutrition, medical care, and education. Someone's been reading to them regularly. Thompson frowned. This didn't match the profile they had on Blackwood. According to their files, he was a calculating criminal who struck fast and disappeared completely. The idea that he'd been traveling with 2 small children while committing federal crimes was unprecedented. "How long do you think they were in that mine?" Rodriguez asked. Emma described 3 day-night cycles, so roughly 72 hours, maybe more. Bernadette's voice carried a hint of anger. Whatever Blackwood was running from, he put those children in mortal danger. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen, who approached their table with obvious concern. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation upstairs. Emma is asking for someone named Samuel, and she's becoming increasingly agitated. She won't eat, won't sleep, and she's trying to get out of bed to look for him." Thompson and Rodriguez exchanged glances. They'd seen this before with children of fugitives, a loyalty so deep it bordered on programmed behavior. "Can we speak with her?" Thompson asked, briefly and only with Ms. Martinez present. "That child has been through enough trauma." Emma's hospital room was on the 4th floor, overlooking the Denver skyline. The little girl was sitting up in bed, her dark eyes scanning every person who entered, as if hoping one of them would be her father. Ethan was in the bed beside her, finally awake, but still weak from his ordeal. "Emma, these are some friends of mine," Bernadette said gently. "They want to help us find your daddy." The child's reaction was immediate and defensive. "Daddy doesn't need help, he's coming back. He always comes back." Thompson knelt beside the bed, keeping his voice soft and non-threatening. "Emma, I'm Agent Thompson. Can you tell me about the last time you saw your daddy?" Emma's lip quivered, but she answered. "He was scared. There were cars coming up the mountain road, and Daddy said we had to play the hiding game. He carried us to the mine and said to wait right there until he came back." "Did you see the cars?" Rodriguez asked. Emma nodded. "Big black cars. Daddy said they were the bad guys, and we had to be very quiet so they wouldn't find us." Thompson felt a chill. If Blackwood had been running from law enforcement when he stashed the children, it meant he'd been willing to risk their lives rather than surrender. But it also meant he might have been cornered, which could explain why he hadn't returned. "Emma, did your daddy ever talk about a special place where you would go if you got separated?" Thompson asked, hoping to uncover any safe houses or hideouts. The girl's eyes grew suspicious. "Why do you want to know? Are you the bad guys Daddy was running from?" Before Thompson could respond, Ethan spoke for the first time since regaining consciousness. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "Daddy said never tell strangers about the safe places." The twins had been coached, Thompson realized. Blackwood had prepared them for exactly this scenario, capture and interrogation. But he'd also trained them to resist, which meant getting information from them would be nearly impossible. "We're not bad guys," Bernadette said, taking Emma's hand. "We're the people who want to make sure you and Ethan are safe and healthy." "Then let us go find Daddy," Emma replied with startling logic. "We know where he is." This statement electrified the room, Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "Where is he, Emma?" But the little girl had already said too much. She pressed her lips together and shook her head, mimicking a gesture they'd probably seen their father make countless times when questioned. Thompson made the decision to step back. Pushing too hard would only traumatize the children further, and likely yield no useful information. Blackwood had trained them well. Outside the hospital room, the agents huddled with Bernadette to discuss their next moves. "We need to put surveillance on this hospital," Thompson said. "If Blackwood is going to surface anywhere, it'll be here, trying to get to his kids." "What about the children?" Bernadette asked. "They can't stay in the hospital indefinitely, and I doubt they're going to cooperate with foster placement." Rodriguez consulted her notes. "According to our files, there's no record of Samuel Blackwood having children. No birth certificates, no medical records, nothing. These kids don't officially exist." This revelation added another layer to the mystery. How had Blackwood managed to keep two children completely off the grid while providing them with proper medical care and education? It suggested a level of organization and resources that went far beyond what they'd attributed to him. "We need to run DNA tests," Thompson decided. "Confirm they're actually his children and see if we can trace any relatives." While the agents coordinated with the hospital to begin the bureaucratic process of dealing with undocumented children, Bernadette returned to sit with Emma and Ethan. The twins had fallen asleep holding hands, a gesture that spoke to the bond that had sustained them through their ordeal. 3 floors below, Samuel Blackwood stood in the hospital parking garage, watching the entrance through binoculars. He'd arrived an hour ago, after tracking the news reports about children being found in the Silverbrook mine. His heart had nearly stopped when he realized they were talking about Emma and Ethan. For 3 days, he'd been trapped in an abandoned cabin 20 miles north of the mine, pinned down by a manhunt that had swept through the mountains like wildfire. Someone had tipped off the FBI about his location, and he'd barely escaped with his life. The original plan had been to retrieve the children within hours, but everything had gone wrong. Now, seeing the federal agents entering and leaving the hospital, he knew the situation had become infinitely more complicated. His children were no longer just hiding. They were in federal custody, which meant any attempt to retrieve them would be seen as kidnapping, even though they were his own kids. Samuel Blackwood was not the man the FBI files described. At 34, he was lean and weathered from years of outdoor living, with the kind of quiet intensity that came from constantly watching over his shoulder. But the most striking thing about him was his eyes. They held a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with his reputation as a ruthless criminal. The truth was more complicated than any law enforcement profile could capture. Samuel had been a rancher in Montana before his life fell apart. His wife, Maria, had died in a car accident when the twins were barely 2 years old, leaving him alone with 2 toddlers and a mountain of medical debt from her extended illness. That first bank robbery had been an act of desperation. He'd needed money for the children's care and had convinced himself it would be a one-time thing. But desperation had a way of becoming habit, and one robbery had led to another, each one making it harder to return to legitimate life. Now, as he watched his children's hospital window, Samuel faced the hardest decision of his criminal career. He could walk away, disappear completely, and let Emma and Ethan have a chance at a normal life, or he could risk everything to get them back, knowing that his presence in their lives might ultimately destroy any hope they had for a future. Inside the hospital, Emma had woken up and was staring out the window with an intensity that made Bernadette uneasy. "What are you looking for, sweetheart?" Bernadette asked. "Daddy's out there," Emma said with absolute certainty. "He's watching us. He always watches us when we're sleeping to make sure we're safe." Bernadette felt a chill. She moved to the window and looked down at the parking garage, but saw nothing unusual. Still, something about Emma's confidence troubled her. The child wasn't hoping her father was nearby. She knew he was. "Emma, how do you know Daddy is out there?" The little girl pointed to a small scar on her wrist. "Daddy and I have matching scars. Mine itches when he's close by. It's itching now." Bernadette realized this wasn't some mystical connection. It was likely a learned behavior. Samuel Blackwood had probably taught his daughter to watch for specific signs or signals that would indicate his presence. The itching scar was probably her way of recognizing something she'd been trained to notice. She immediately called Thompson, who was in the hospital lobby coordinating with security. "Marcus, Emma thinks her father is here. She's exhibiting behavior that suggests she's been trained to recognize when he's nearby." Thompson was moving before she finished the sentence. "Lock down that floor. Nobody in or out without authorization." But Samuel Blackwood was already gone. He'd seen the sudden increase in security activity and recognized the signs of a building lockdown. His children were safe, which was what mattered most, but they were also prisoners, which meant he had limited options. From his truck parked 3 blocks away, Samuel made a phone call to a number he'd hoped never to use again. "It's me," he said when the call was answered. "Jesus, Sam, do you know how many people are looking for you right now?" The voice belonged to Danny Cortez, Samuel's former partner in several heists and the closest thing he had to a friend in the criminal world. "They have my kids, Danny." There was a long pause. Danny was one of the few people who knew about Emma and Ethan, having helped Samuel with false documents and safe houses over the years. How did that happen? Samuel explained the situation at the mine, the failed plan, and the current standoff at the hospital. "You need to walk away, Sam," Danny said finally. "Those kids will be better off without you. They'll get placed with a good family, go to real schools, have normal lives. They're my children, and because of that, they've been living like fugitives since they were 2 years old. When's the last time they went to a playground without you scanning for threats? When's the last time they made friends with other kids?" The questions hit Samuel like physical blows because he knew Danny was right. Emma and Ethan had never had birthday parties with friends, never played on sports teams, never experienced the simple joys of childhood that other kids took for granted. Their entire world had been shaped by his choices and his crimes, but they were also his world. The thought of living without them, of never again reading them bedtime stories or making them laugh with silly voices, was unbearable. "There's another option," Danny said quietly. "Turn yourself in. Negotiate for regular visitation rights. Maybe if you cooperate, give them information about other jobs. They'll work with you on a custody arrangement." Samuel had considered this possibility, but he knew too much about how the federal system worked. He was facing multiple life sentences across several states. Even with cooperation, he'd likely never see freedom again, and his children would grow up visiting their father in federal prison. "I need to think," Samuel said. "Don't think too long, brother. Every hour you wait makes this situation worse for those kids." As night fell over Denver, 3 separate groups of people were making plans that would collide in ways none of them could foresee. In the hospital, Bernadette sat with Emma and Ethan, trying to provide comfort while federal agents maintained surveillance. In the federal building, Thompson and Rodriguez were coordinating a manhunt that spanned 5 states, convinced that Samuel Blackwood would make a move to contact his children. And somewhere in the city, Samuel himself was wrestling with a decision that would determine the fate of the only family he had left. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the bonds of family against the weight of justice and force everyone involved to confront what they were truly willing to sacrifice. For the people they claimed to protect, dawn broke over Denver with the kind of crisp clarity that only came after mountain storms. Inside Denver General Hospital, Emma had barely slept, spending most of the night pressed against the window, her small hand leaving fog prints on the glass as she searched the streets below. Bernadette had dozed fitfully in the chair beside Emma's bed, waking every time the child stirred or whispered her father's name. The Federal Protection Detail had been stationed outside the room since midnight, but their presence seemed to make Emma more anxious rather than reassured. Dr. Chen arrived for morning rounds with news that would complicate everything. "Both children are medically cleared for discharge," she announced to the assembled group of agents and social workers. "Physically, they've recovered remarkably well from their ordeal." Agent Thompson rubbed his tired eyes. The manhunt for Samuel Blackwood had expanded overnight, with roadblocks established throughout Colorado and neighboring states. But so far, the fugitive had vanished as completely as he had after his previous crimes. "Where do we place them?" Bernadette asked, voicing the question everyone was avoiding. "These children don't exist on paper. No birth certificates, no social security numbers, no records of any kind." Agent Rodriguez had spent the night diving deep into Samuel Blackwood's background, and what she'd discovered painted a more complex picture than anyone had anticipated. "I need to brief everyone on what we've learned," she said, setting down a thick folder of documents. The briefing room at the federal building was cramped, filled with local law enforcement, FBI agents, and social services personnel. Rodriguez stood at the front, pulling up documents on a projection screen. "Samuel Blackwood's real name is Samuel Martinez Blackwood," she began. "He legally changed it after his wife's death. Maria Elena Martinez died 3 years ago from complications related to lupus. The medical bills from her 2-year battle with the disease exceeded $400,000. Bernadette felt her stomach drop. The surname Martinez meant something to her that it didn't to the others in the room. It was her own family name. But Colorado was full of Martinez families, and she pushed the coincidence aside to focus on Rodriguez's briefing. Blackwood owned a cattle ranch in Billings, Montana, jointly with his brother-in-law, Diego Martinez. When Maria died, the medical debt forced them to sell the ranch. That's when Samuel disappeared with the children, and 3 weeks later, the First National Bank of Billings was robbed of $63,000. The timeline painted a clear picture of desperation leading to crime. Thompson leaned forward. "What happened to the brother-in-law?" "Diego Martinez died in a farming accident 6 months after Samuel disappeared. Single-vehicle rollover. Local police ruled it accidental, but the timing is suspicious." Rodriguez clicked to the next slide, showing financial records. Here's where it gets interesting. Every bank Samuel Blackwood robbed was owned by Meridian Financial Group. Over 2 years, he hit 7 of their branches across 4 states, always for amounts between $50,000 and $70,000. "That's oddly specific," Thompson noted. "Most bank robbers escalate, go for bigger scores as they get more confident." "Exactly, and here's the other pattern. Every robbery occurred within 2 weeks of Diego Martinez's death anniversary, and always in towns that had recently had medical facilities or rural hospitals closed due to debt." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't a random crime. It was targeted revenge against a system that Samuel Blackwood blamed for destroying his family. Meanwhile, 3 miles across the city, Samuel sat in a small diner that catered to truckers and shift workers. He'd barely touched his coffee, instead staring at a burner phone that contained the most important contact in his children's lives. Someone they'd never met, but whose existence he'd kept secret for their own protection. The number belonged to Elena Santos, Maria's older sister, who lived in Albuquerque and had been sending Samuel money and supplies for the past 2 years. Elena was a nurse practitioner who had helped him maintain the children's medical care while they lived off the grid. Samuel finally dialed the number, knowing that this conversation would change everything. "Samuel?" Elena's voice was filled with concern. "I've been watching the news. Are Emma and Ethan safe?" "They're in the hospital. Federal custody. Samuel's voice cracked slightly. Eleanor, I think it's time. There was a long pause. Elena had been urging Samuel to contact her for months, offering to take the children and raise them legally. She had the resources, the stability, and most importantly, the family connection that would give Emma and Ethan a real home. I can be there by tonight, Elena said. But Samuel, you know what this means. Once I step forward, there's no going back to the way things were. I know. Samuel stared out at the Denver skyline, knowing his children were somewhere in that maze of buildings. But look what the alternative got them, half frozen in a mine, thinking I abandoned them. Back at the hospital, Emma had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep when a new visitor arrived. Elena Santos presented herself to the security desk with a calm authority that immediately got everyone's attention. I'm here about the Martinez children, she told the desk sergeant. I'm their aunt. Within minutes, Agent Thompson was in the lobby, studying the woman who might be the key to solving their custody dilemma. Elena was in her early 40s, with the same dark hair and eyes as the twins. She carried herself with the professional confidence of someone used to handling crises. Miss Santos, we weren't aware the children had any family. Elena's expression was carefully controlled. Their father has been protecting them by keeping them isolated, but the situation has clearly become untenable. She produced documents from her purse, copies of Maria's birth certificate, her own identification, and medical records showing her relationship to the children's mother. Everything appeared legitimate, but Thompson remained skeptical. How long have you known about Emma and Ethan? He asked. Since they were born, I've been sending their father money and medical supplies for 2 years, hoping he would eventually bring them to me voluntarily. This admission created a legal minefield. Elena could potentially be charged as an accessory to Samuel's crimes if she'd knowingly aided a fugitive, but it also represented the best hope for the children's future. I want to see them, Elena said, simply. The meeting between Elena and the twins took place in a conference room under heavy security. Emma was initially wary, but when Elena spoke to her in Spanish, the same lullabies Maria had sung, the little girl's defenses crumbled. Tia Elena, Emma whispered, using the Spanish word for aunt that she remembered from her mother's stories. Sí, mi amor, I'm here now. Ethan, still weak but more alert, studied Elena with the same careful attention his father had taught him to use with strangers. But when she showed him a photo of his mother holding both twins as babies, his composure broke. Mama, he whispered, touching the photograph with one small finger. Elena spent 2 hours with the children, and by the end, even the hardened federal agents in the room were moved by the obvious connection. These weren't strangers meeting for the first time. This was a family reunion that had been delayed by desperate circumstances, but the legal complications were enormous. Thompson pulled Elena aside as the visit concluded. Ms. Santos, we need to discuss your situation. You've admitted to providing material support to a federal fugitive. That's a serious crime. Elena met his gaze steadily. Agent Thompson, I'm a nurse practitioner who helped ensure that 2 small children received proper medical care while living in impossible circumstances. If you want to prosecute me for that, go ahead. But those children need stability, and I can provide it. Her directness impressed Thompson, but he had protocols to follow. We'll need a full debrief about your contact with Samuel Blackwood, and we'll need to verify your ability to provide a suitable home for the children. I understand. But I also need you to understand something. Samuel isn't the monster your files make him out to be. He's a broken man who made terrible choices to protect his children after losing everything he cared about. As Elena spoke, Samuel was making his own preparations 6 blocks away. He'd spent the day acquiring the supplies he needed for what might be his final play, not to escape with his children, but to ensure their future safety. The storage unit on the outskirts of Denver contained everything Samuel had accumulated over 2 years of robberies. Not just money, but documents, photographs, and evidence that painted a very different picture of his crimes than what law enforcement believed. Samuel had kept meticulous records of every dollar stolen and where it had gone, medical expenses for the children, payments to Elena for their care, and donations to rural hospitals that had been closed by Meridian Financial Group. The revenge element of his crimes was real, but it was more complex than simple retaliation. More importantly, the storage unit contained something that could change everything, evidence of corruption within Meridian Financial that went far beyond predatory lending practices. Samuel had stumbled across the information during his research into the company that had destroyed his family. Meridian wasn't just foreclosing on medical debt, they were deliberately targeting rural communities, forcing hospital closures, then buying the land at below-market prices for development projects. His robberies had been partly revenge, but they'd also been a way to finance his own investigation into the company's practices. Now facing the loss of his children, Samuel realized this evidence might be his only bargaining chip with federal authorities. As night fell, Samuel made one final call to Elena. "I'm going to surrender tomorrow," he told her. "But I need you to promise me something. Don't let them paint me as just another criminal. Those children deserve to know why I made the choices I did. Samuel, there might be another way." "No!" His voice was firm. "Emma and Ethan deserve better than a life on the run. They deserve school and friends and birthday parties and all. The things I could never give them. You can give them that." Elena was crying now, mourning the loss of a brother-in-law she'd tried to save for 3 years. "The children love you, Samuel. That love doesn't disappear just because you made mistakes. Maybe someday they'll understand. Maybe someday they'll forgive me." After ending the call, Samuel sat in his truck outside the federal building, looking up at the lights in the windows where agents were working through the night to find him. Tomorrow, he would walk through those doors and end the manhunt that had consumed his life for 2 years. But tonight, he drove back to the hospital one more time, parking in the same spot where he'd watched his children's room the night before. Emma was at the window again, her small silhouette visible against the hospital room lights. Samuel pulled out a small flashlight and aimed it at Emma's window, flashing it 3 times, their old signal that meant "I love you" in the code they'd developed during their years of hiding. Emma's reaction was immediate. She pressed both hands against the window and flashed the room lights 3 times in response, their signal for "I love you too." For Samuel Blackwood, it was goodbye. For Emma, watching her father's shadow disappear into the Denver night, it was a promise that love could survive even the deepest darkness. The next morning would bring surrender, revelations, and the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. But in that moment, the connection between father and daughter transcended law and justice, proving that some bonds were stronger than any crime or punishment. Samuel Blackwood walked into the Denver Federal Building at exactly 9 a.m., carrying nothing but a small backpack and the weight of 3 years' worth of choices. He'd spent the morning at a truck stop, showering and changing into clean clothes, not out of vanity, but because he wanted his children to remember him looking like the father they knew, not the fugitive the world saw. The lobby was busy with the usual morning traffic of federal employees and visitors, none of whom recognized the man who'd been the subject of a multi-state manhunt. Samuel approached the security desk with the calm resignation of someone who'd already accepted his fate. "I'm here to see Agent Thompson," he said quietly. "Tell him Samuel Blackwood is ready to surrender." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within seconds, the lobby was swarming with security personnel, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands. Samuel raised his hand slowly, his eyes never leaving the elevator bank where he knew his children were somewhere above. The backpack contains evidence, not weapons, he said clearly, his voice cutting through the chaos. I'm here to cooperate. Agent Thompson arrived in the lobby within minutes, having been alerted by the security team. He'd spent countless hours studying Samuel Blackwood's criminal profile, but seeing the man in person was jarring. This wasn't the hardened criminal he'd expected. This was someone who looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 years. "Mr. Blackwood," Thompson said, approaching cautiously despite the security presence. "You're under arrest for multiple federal charges, including bank robbery, weapons violations, and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution." Samuel nodded as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I understand. But first, you need to see what's in the backpack. It changes everything about why I did what I did." The interrogation room at the Denver Federal Building was small and windowless, designed to make suspects feel isolated and pressured. But Samuel seemed almost relieved to be there, as if the burden of running had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Thompson and Rodriguez sat across from him, the mysterious backpack between them on the table. Samuel had waived his right to an attorney, insisting he wanted to tell his story immediately. "Before we begin," Samuel said, "I need to know about my children. Are they safe? Are they being treated well?" "They're fine," Thompson replied. "They're with their aunt, Elena Santos, under supervised custody at the hospital." Relief flooded Samuel's features. "Elena's a good woman. She'll take care of them." Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mr. Blackwood, you're facing multiple life sentences. Anything you tell us needs to be the complete truth if you want us to consider any kind of cooperation agreement." Samuel unzipped the backpack and began removing its contents methodically. First came financial documents, detailed records of every dollar he'd stolen and where it had gone, medical bills, payments to Elena, donations to rural hospitals. But then came something unexpected: corporate documents, financial records, and correspondence that had nothing to do with his crimes. 3 years ago, Meridian Financial Group destroyed my family, Samuel began. They used predatory lending practices to inflate my wife's medical debt, then foreclosed on everything we owned while she was dying. But that wasn't enough for them. He spread out a series of documents showing land acquisitions, hospital closures, and development projects across rural Montana, Colorado, and Wyoming. After Maria died, I started investigating Meridian. What I found was a systematic operation targeting rural communities. They would buy up medical debt, force hospitals to close, then acquire the land for commercial development at a fraction of its value. Thompson studied the documents with growing interest. "This is why you targeted their banks specifically." "Partly, but also because I needed funding to continue the investigation." Samuel pulled out a laptop and opened a series of encrypted files. "For 2 years, I've been documenting their operations: bribery of local officials, manipulation of zoning laws, intimidation of hospital administrators who tried to resist." Rodriguez examined the laptop screen. "Where did you get this information?" "I broke into their regional offices during some of the bank robberies. While everyone was focused on the money I was taking from the vault, I was copying files from their computers." Samuel's voice carried a note of pride. "They never even knew what I was really after." The evidence was overwhelming. If authentic, it represented a federal case against Meridian Financial that could result in hundreds of millions in fines and prison sentences for corporate executives. It was also Samuel's only leverage in negotiating his children's future. "Why bring this to us now?" Thompson asked. Samuel's composure finally cracked. "Because Emma and Ethan deserve better than having a criminal for a father. If this evidence helps other families avoid what happened to mine, maybe some good can come from the mess I made of our lives." While Samuel was confessing his crimes and motivations 6 floors above in the federal building's Family Services Wing, Elena was fighting her own battle. The Department of Child Services had arrived with questions about her suitability as a guardian, and the answers weren't straightforward. Bernadette Martinez had been assigned as the twins' advocate, and she found herself in the unusual position of defending a woman who'd aided a federal fugitive, but spending time with Elena and the children had convinced her that this family connection was real and vital. "Ms. Santos," said Janet Wheeler, the DCS supervisor, "you've admitted to providing material support to a known criminal. How can we be certain you'll provide appropriate guidance for these children?" Elena maintained her composure, but Emma, who was sitting nearby playing with Ethan, looked up with the sharp attention of a child who'd learned to monitor adult conversations for signs of danger. "I provided medical supplies and financial support to ensure 2 innocent children received proper health care," Elena replied. "I would do it again tomorrow under the same circumstances." Bernadette intervened. "The children have been remarkably well cared for despite their circumstances. Someone taught them proper hygiene, basic education, social skills. They're polite, articulate, and emotionally stable, considering what they've been through. But they've also been living completely off the grid," Wheeler countered. "No schooling, no social interaction with other children, no stability. These children need structure and normalcy." Emma stood up suddenly, her small face flushed with anger. "We had structure. Daddy made us breakfast every morning and read to us every night and taught us how to be safe and how to be kind and how to take care of each other." The outburst silenced the room. Ethan moved to stand beside his sister, and the 2 children faced the adults with a united front that was both heartbreaking and impressive. "Daddy's not bad," Ethan added quietly. "He just got sad when Mama died, and sad people sometimes make mistakes." Elena knelt down to the children's level. "Your daddy loves you very much, and no one here is saying he doesn't. But sometimes love means making hard choices to keep the people we care about safe." Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Samuel was facing his own version of the same conversation. Thompson had finished reviewing the Meridian evidence and was now focused on the future. "This information is valuable, potentially valuable enough to influence your sentencing," Thompson said. "But we need your full cooperation in building the case against Meridian, and we need assurance that you'll accept whatever custody arrangement is made for your children." Samuel stared at his hands, still bearing the calluses from his ranching days. "What kind of sentence are we talking about?" "With cooperation and given the circumstances that led to your crimes, possibly 15 to 20 years instead of life. You'd be eligible for parole in 12 years if you maintain good behavior." 12 years. Emma and Ethan would be 16. When he got out, if he got out, they'd be adults who might not even remember the father who'd read them bedtime stories and made them laugh during the darkest period of their lives. "What about visitation?" Samuel asked. Rodriguez answered. "That would depend on the custody arrangement and the children's best interests as they grow up. It's not something we can guarantee." Samuel closed his eyes, seeing Emma's face pressed against the hospital window, seeing Ethan's small hand reaching for his during their last morning together in the mine. Every choice he'd made for 3 years had been about protecting them, but his protection had ultimately put them in more danger than any foster system ever could. "I'll take the deal," he said finally. "But I want to see them one more time before I'm transferred. I need to explain why I'm not coming with them." The meeting between Samuel and his children took place in a supervised visitation room designed for family court cases. Elena was present, along with Bernadette Thompson and a child psychologist who specialized in family separation trauma. Emma ran to her father the moment she saw him, despite the handcuffs and the presence of guards. Samuel dropped to his knees to embrace both children, his composure completely shattered for the first time since his surrender. "Daddy, are you coming home with us now?" Emma asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Samuel pulled back to look at both children, memorizing their faces. "No, sweetheart. Daddy has to go away for a while. I made some bad choices, and now I have to face the consequences." "But we forgive you," Ethan said simply. "Families forgive each other." The statement hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Samuel's tears came freely now. "I know you do, buddy. And I forgive you too, for anything you might do that you think is bad, okay? That's what families do." Elena moved closer, understanding that this was her moment to step into the role she'd been preparing for since Maria's death. "Emma, Ethan, would you like to come live with me in Albuquerque? I have a big house with a yard and good schools nearby." Emma looked between her father and her aunt, understanding more than any 4-year-old should have to. "Will Daddy know where we are?" "Yes," Elena promised, "and maybe someday, when he's ready, he can come visit us there." Samuel spent 30 more minutes with his children, telling them stories about their mother, explaining that Elena would love them and keep them safe, and making promises about letters and phone calls that he hoped the system would allow him to keep. When it was time to leave, Emma hugged him one final time. "Daddy, will you still love us even when you're far away? Forever and always." Samuel whispered, "No matter where I am, no matter how much time passes, you are the best thing that ever happened to me." As Samuel was led away in shackles, Elena gathered the twins close to her. They watched through the window as their father was placed in a federal transport vehicle, and Emma pressed her hand against the glass one more time. "It's okay to be sad," Elena told them. "It's okay to miss him. And it's okay to love him even though he made mistakes." The vehicle carrying Samuel Blackwood pulled away from the federal building, heading toward a future that would likely keep him imprisoned until his children were adults. But the evidence he'd provided would eventually bring down Meridian Financial Group, preventing countless other families from suffering the same fate that had destroyed his own. In the aftermath of his surrender, 3 different groups of people would spend years dealing with the consequences of Samuel's choices. Federal prosecutors would build a massive case against corporate corruption. Elena would navigate the complex process of legally adopting her niece and nephew while helping them heal from trauma. And Bernadette would find herself forever changed by a case that challenged everything she thought she knew about crime, punishment, and the lengths parents would go to protect their children. But in that moment, as Elena drove Emma and Ethan toward their new life in Albuquerque, the most important truth was simple. Love had survived the worst circumstances imaginable, and sometimes that was enough to build a future on. 2 months after Samuel's surrender, Elena Santos stood in the doorway of what would become Emma and Ethan's bedroom in her Albuquerque home. The room had been transformed from her home office into a child sanctuary, with twin beds positioned so the children could see each other, a detail Emma had specifically requested because Ethan gets scared when he can't see me. The legal proceedings had been surprisingly swift. Samuel's cooperation in the Meridian Financial case, combined with Elena's spotless background check and the children's obvious attachment to her, had smoothed the path for emergency custody placement. But the emotional transition was proving far more complex than any legal document could address. Emma had stopped talking almost entirely since arriving in Albuquerque, communicating primarily through gestures and whispers to Ethan, who had become her translator to the adult world. The child psychologist Elena had consulted explained that selective mutism was common among children who'd experienced significant trauma and loss of control over their environment. "She's protecting herself," Dr. Patricia Vega had explained during their first session. "Speaking makes her vulnerable, and she's learned that vulnerability can be dangerous." Ethan, meanwhile, had thrown himself into exploring their new environment with an intensity that worried Elena. He catalogued every exit from the house, memorized the locations of emergency supplies, and asked detailed questions about neighborhood. Security that no 5-year-old should need to consider. Elena's house sat on 2 acres in the foothills outside Albuquerque, surrounded by piñon pines and with a view of the Sandia Mountains that reminded the children of their time with their father. She'd chosen the location carefully, wanting them to feel connected to the landscape they knew while providing the stability they'd never experienced. The daily routine Elena established was deliberately predictable. Breakfast at 7, educational. Activities in the morning, lunch together, quiet time, outdoor play, dinner, bath time, and bedtime stories. It was the kind of structured childhood Samuel had wanted to give them, but never could while running from federal authorities. But structure couldn't heal the deeper wounds left by their father's absence. 3 weeks into their stay, Elena woke at 2 a.m. to find both children missing from their beds. Panic shot through her as she searched the house, calling their names with increasing desperation. She found them in the garage, fully dressed and sitting beside packed backpacks, waiting by the door. "We have to go find Daddy," Emma said, speaking, "for the first time in days. He might be looking for us and he won't know where we are." Elena knelt beside them in the cold garage, her heart breaking at the sight of their determined little faces. "Daddy knows where you are, sweetheart. Remember, he wanted you to stay with me where you'd be safe." "But what if he's hurt?" Ethan asked. "What if he needs us to take care of him?" The question revealed something Elena hadn't fully understood. These children hadn't just been living with their father, they'd been taking care of him. In their minds, Samuel needed them as much as they needed him, and their sudden removal from his life meant he was now alone and vulnerable. "Your daddy is being taken care of by other people now," Elena said carefully. "And your job is to be kids, not to worry about taking care of adults." This conversation led to Elena's decision to contact the federal prison system about arranging communication between Samuel and his children. The process was complicated by his status as a federal prisoner awaiting sentencing, but Agent Thompson proved unexpectedly helpful in navigating the bureaucracy. "The children's welfare has to be the priority," Thompson told Elena during one of their phone calls. "If supervised contact with their father helps them adjust to their new situation, we can make it happen." The first phone call between Samuel and his children took place on a Wednesday afternoon, with Elena monitoring the conversation and a prison supervisor recording everything for security purposes. The sound of their father's voice through the prison phone system made both children cry, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. "Are you eating enough food?" Emma asked, her first concern being Samuel's well-being. "Are there other daddies there to keep you company so you're not lonely?" Ethan added. Samuel's voice was thick with emotion as he answered their questions and asked about their new life with Elena. He told them about the books he was reading in prison, described the mountains he could see from his cell window, and made them laugh with stories about the prison cat that had adopted him. But the most important part of the conversation came at the end. "I need you both to listen to me very carefully," Samuel said. "Your job now is to be happy, okay? Your job is to go to school and make friends and learn new things and not worry about me. I'm safe, and I'm proud of you, and I love you more than all the stars in the sky." After the call ended, both children seemed lighter, as if a weight they'd been carrying had been lifted. That night, Emma spoke at dinner for the first time since arriving, asking Eleanor about the school she would attend in the fall. Meanwhile, in Denver, Bernadette Martinez was dealing with her own complex emotions about the Blackwood case. The successful resolution should have felt like a victory. The children were safe, the fugitive was captured, and a major corporate corruption case was moving forward. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the system had failed everyone involved. She'd been following the Meridian financial investigation through her contacts in the FBI, and the scope of the corporate crimes was staggering. Samuel's evidence had uncovered a network of corruption involving dozens of officials across multiple states, all designed to extract maximum profit from rural healthcare crises. The irony wasn't lost on her. Samuel Blackwood, branded as a dangerous criminal, had been fighting a more systemic form of crime that had harmed thousands of families. His methods were illegal and wrong, but his targets had been far from innocent. Bernadette's supervisor had recommended her for a commendation based on her handling of the case, but she'd declined. Something about accepting recognition for a case that had torn a family apart felt wrong, even if it was the legally correct outcome. Instead, she found herself volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped families navigate medical debt and bankruptcy proceedings. It was her way of addressing the root causes that had driven Samuel Blackwood to crime in the first place. One evening, while reviewing case files for the legal aid clinic, Bernadette received an unexpected phone call from Elena Santos. "I hope you don't mind my calling," Elena said. "I got your number from Agent Thompson. I wanted to update you on how Emma and Ethan are doing and to ask you something." Elena described the children's progress over the past 2 months, their gradual adaptation to routine life, their enrollment in a local elementary school for the fall, and their scheduled weekly phone calls with their father. "They ask about you sometimes," Elena said. "Emma especially remembers how kind you were to her in the hospital. She calls you the lady who found us in the dark place." Bernadette felt her throat tighten. How are they really doing? "Better than I expected. Honestly, children are resilient in ways that constantly amaze me, but they carry their father's love with them like armor. Whatever else Samuel did wrong, he raised 2 kids who know they're valued and loved." Eleanor's request was simple but meaningful. She wanted to arrange a visit between Bernadette and the children. Not for any official purpose, but because Emma had specifically asked to see her again. "She wants to show you her new room and tell you about the school she's going to attend," Elena explained. "I think seeing you happy and settled might help her understand that good things can come from difficult situations." The visit was arranged for the following weekend. Bernadette drove to Albuquerque on a Saturday morning, nervous about seeing the children in their new environment. She'd been involved in hundreds of child welfare cases over the years, but few had affected her as deeply as Emma and Ethan's story. Elena's house was exactly what Bernadette would have chosen for the twins, spacious but not overwhelming, surrounded by nature but close to community resources. The children greeted her with enthusiasm that surprised all the adults present. Emma gave Bernadette a tour of the house, proudly showing off her bedroom, the art supplies Elena had bought for her, and the small garden where she was learning to grow vegetables. Ethan demonstrated his reading skills, sounding out words from a picture book about mountain wildlife. During lunch, Emma asked Bernadette a question that revealed how much she'd been thinking about their time in the mine. "Miss Bernadette, when you found us in the dark place, did you know Daddy was a good person, even though other people said he was bad?" The question was impossible to answer simply. Bernadette chose her words carefully. "I knew that you and Ethan were loved, Emma. I could see it in how you took care of each other and how you talked about your daddy. Love doesn't make bad choices okay, but it's still real and important. Daddy says love is the strongest thing in the world," Ethan added, "stronger than being scared or being apart or even being in trouble." After lunch, Elena walked Bernadette through the garden while the children played in the backyard. "They're going to be okay," Elena said, watching Emma push Ethan on a tire swing hung from an old cottonwood tree. "It's going to take time and there will be difficult moments, but they have what they need to build good lives." "What about Samuel?" Bernadette asked. "How is he handling the separation?" Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "According to the prison counselor I've been in contact with, he's doing better than expected. He's teaching literacy classes to other inmates, working on his GED, and writing letters to the children that they'll be able to read when they're older. I think having a purpose beyond just surviving is helping him. As afternoon turned to evening, Bernadette prepared to drive back to Denver. Emma hugged her goodbye and whispered something that would stay with her for years. "Thank you for bringing us home." The simple statement encapsulated something profound about the nature of home and family. Home wasn't the mine where they'd been hidden, or the various safe houses where they'd lived with their father. Home wasn't even necessarily the place where they'd been born. Home was where they were known, valued, and safe to grow into themselves. Elena had given them that, but it had taken a village of people, social workers, federal agents, medical professionals, and others, to make it possible. As Bernadette drove through the New Mexico desert toward Colorado, she reflected on how the case had changed everyone involved. Samuel was serving his sentence, but had found purpose in helping other inmates. Elena had become an instant mother to two traumatized children and was rising to the challenge with grace. Emma and Ethan were learning what normal childhood looked like while carrying their father's love as a source of strength rather than burden. Even Agent Thompson had been affected. He told her during a recent conversation that the Blackwood case had made him think differently about the intersection of desperation and crime, leading him to advocate for more resources for families facing medical bankruptcy. The case had also led to significant policy changes. The evidence Samuel provided against Meridian Financial had resulted in new federal regulations governing medical debt collection and rural hospital acquisitions. The company's executives were facing prison sentences of their own, and victim compensation funds had been established for affected families. But perhaps the most important change was harder to quantify: a growing recognition that the line between victim and perpetrator was often blurrier than the legal system acknowledged. Samuel Blackwood had committed serious crimes, but he'd also exposed corruption that had harmed thousands of people. His children had been endangered by his choices, but they'd also been loved and protected in ways that many children in traditional families never experienced. As Bernadette reached the Colorado border, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible when she first received Jake Morrison's call about children in the Silverbrook mine. She would maintain contact with Elena and the twins, not as a social worker monitoring their case, but as someone who cared about their well-being and wanted to watch them grow and thrive. Sometimes the most important work happened not in crisis moments, but in the quiet years that followed, when love and stability had the chance to heal wounds that trauma had created. Emma and Ethan's story was far from over, but they now had the foundation they needed to write their own ending. 5 years had passed since that frozen morning when Bernadette Martinez first descended into the Silverbrook mine. The twins were now 10 years old, thriving students at Albuquerque Academy, and had grown into confident children who bore little resemblance to the frightened, half-frozen waifs found in that abandoned storage chamber. Emma had discovered a talent for creative writing, penning, stories about adventures and families that always ended with reunions and forgiveness. Her teacher, Mrs. Rebecca Foster, had called Eleanor with concern after Emma submitted a particularly vivid story about a princess whose father was imprisoned in a distant castle, but who sent her magical letters that glowed with love. "Is Emma processing some kind of family trauma?" Mrs. Foster had asked gently. The story was beautiful, but there's an emotional depth there that seems beyond her years. Eleanor had smiled sadly. "Emma has experienced more loss than most adults, but she's learned to channel it into something creative and healing. That story probably means she's ready for the next step in her relationship with her father." That next step was something Eleanor had been preparing for over the past year, the twins' first in-person visit with Samuel since his imprisonment. The federal prison in Florence, Colorado, had approved supervised family visitation after Samuel's exemplary behavior during his incarceration. He'd earned his GED, completed a bachelor's degree through correspondence courses, and had become the prison's head literacy coordinator. More importantly, his letters to Emma and Ethan had evolved from desperate expressions of love and regret into thoughtful discussions of literature, science, and philosophy that challenged and encouraged the children's intellectual growth. Samuel had somehow managed to continue parenting from behind bars, providing guidance and wisdom even from a distance. The drive from Albuquerque to Florence took 5 hours, giving Elena time to prepare the children for what they would encounter. Neither Emma nor Ethan remembered much about visiting anyone in prison, but they'd absorbed enough from movies and television to have misconceptions about what it would involve. "Will Daddy be wearing chains?" Ethan asked as they crossed into Colorado. "No, sweetheart, the visiting room is a place where families can spend time together normally. There will be guards around, but your father will be able to hug you and sit with you just like any other visit." Emma had been quiet for most of the drive, but as they approached the prison, she finally voiced her deeper concern. "What if Daddy doesn't recognize us? We've grown a lot, and we look different now." Elena glanced at Emma in the rearview mirror. The child had indeed changed dramatically. Her hair was longer, her face had lost its baby roundness, and she carried herself with the confidence of a child who'd learned she was capable and valued. But her eyes were still the same warm brown that matched her father's. "Daddy will recognize your hearts," Elena said. "That's what parents see first, not how you look, but who you are inside." The visiting room at ADX Florence was designed to feel as normal as possible. Round tables with plastic chairs, vending machines, children's books scattered on low shelves, and large windows that let in natural light. But the presence of correctional officers and the institutional feel of the space still created an atmosphere unlike any family gathering. Samuel was already seated at a table when they arrived, and Elena's breath caught at the sight of him. Prison had aged him, adding grey to his hair and lines around his eyes, but there was something different about his posture, a peace that hadn't been there during his years as a fugitive. When Emma and Ethan saw their father, their careful composure disappeared entirely. They ran to him with the unself-conscious joy of children who'd been separated too long from someone they loved. Samuel's face transformed as he gathered them into his arms, and for a moment the prison visiting room felt like any other family reunion. "Look how tall you've gotten," Samuel said, holding both children at arm's length to study their faces. "And Emma, your hair is so long and beautiful. Ethan, you have the same serious expression you had when you were 3 years old." The conversation that followed was unlike any Elena had witnessed. Samuel talked to his children as intellectual equals, asking about their studies, their friends, their thoughts on books they'd read and ideas they'd encountered. He treated their observations with the respect typically reserved for adult conversations. "I read the story you sent me about the mountain climber," Samuel told Emma. "The way you described the character's fear and determination reminded me of some of the best adventure writers I've studied. Have you read any Jack London yet?" Emma shook her head, but her eyes lit up with interest. "I'll send you a reading list," Samuel promised. "But I want you to tell me what you think about each book, not just whether you liked it. I want to know what questions the stories make you ask." With Ethan, Samuel discussed the boy's fascination with engineering and mechanical systems. "Aunt Elena tells me you've been taking apart old radios and putting them back together. Are you interested in how things work, or do you like the challenge of solving puzzles?" "Both," Ethan replied thoughtfully. "But mostly I like understanding why things were built the way they were. Like, why did the person who designed it make that choice instead of a different choice? Samuel smiled with obvious pride. That's the question every good engineer asks. You're thinking like a scientist already. As the visit continued, Elena realized that Samuel had found a way to be a father, despite the barriers of imprisonment. His influence on the children was evident in their vocabulary, their curiosity, their way of approaching problems methodically. He'd continued parenting through letters, phone calls, and the kind of intellectual engagement that many present parents never achieved. But the most profound moment came when Emma asked the question Elena had been dreading. "Daddy, do you wish you had made different choices? Do you wish you hadn't done the things that brought you here?" Samuel was quiet for a long time, considering his answer carefully. "I wish I had found a different way to protect you and provide for you after your mother died. I wish I had been strong enough to ask for help instead of thinking I had to handle everything alone." He paused, looking at both children intently. "But I can't wish away everything that happened, because some of those experiences made me understand things I never would have learned otherwise. And they led to you living with Aunt Elena, which has given you opportunities and stability I never could have provided. But you're still our daddy," Ethan said with the simple logic of childhood. "I will always be your daddy," Samuel replied. "But being a parent means wanting what's best for your children, even when that's difficult for you. What's best for you is growing up with Elena, going to school, making friends, and building the kind of life your mother dreamed you would have." The conversation was interrupted by Elena, who'd been watching from nearby, but now approached their table. "Samuel, I need to tell you something. The children don't know yet, but I've been in contact with your lawyer about your upcoming parole hearing." Samuel's expression grew guarded. After 5 years of model behavior and his cooperation in several federal investigations, he was eligible for early parole consideration. But he deliberately avoided discussing it with anyone, knowing that false hope would be worse than acceptance of his full sentence. "The Meridian financial case continues to generate new evidence," Elena continued. "Your initial cooperation led to investigations in 12 states and recovered over $40 million in fraudulent profits. The prosecutor who handled your case has filed a recommendation for sentence reduction." Emma and Ethan looked between the adults, sensing the importance of the conversation, but not fully understanding its implications. "What does that mean?" Emma asked. Elena knelt beside the children's chairs. "It means your daddy might be able to come home sooner than we originally thought. Not right away, but maybe in a few years instead of many years." The children's reaction was immediate joy, but Samuel's response was more complex. "Elena, we need to talk about this privately. There are things to consider beyond just the legal possibilities." After the official visiting time ended, Elena had a brief conversation with Samuel, away from the children. His concerns were practical and heartbreaking. "They have a good life now," he said quietly. "Stable, normal, everything I wanted for them. If I come back into their lives, even as a reformed man, I bring baggage, media attention, stigma, the constant reminder of what I did." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the same selfless love that had driven his original crimes, now channeled into a different kind of sacrifice. "Samuel, they never stopped loving you. They never stopped hoping. Don't you think they deserve the choice of having their father back in their lives? What if I mess it up again? What if I can't handle normal life after 5 years in here? What if you trust the man you've become instead of fearing the man you used to be?" Elena interrupted gently. "You've spent 5 years earning a degree, teaching other inmates, and staying connected to your children in meaningful ways. You're not the same person who robbed those banks." The drive back to Albuquerque was filled with chatter as Emma and Ethan processed their visit with their father. They talked about his appearance, his stories, his questions about their lives, and most importantly, the possibility that he might return to their world. "If Daddy comes home, will he live with us?" Ethan asked. Elena had been thinking about this question for months. That would be something we'd all have to discuss together. There are many ways families can be structured. The important thing is that everyone feels loved and safe. Emma, who had been staring out the window at the passing landscape, suddenly spoke with startling maturity. I think Daddy is scared about coming home because he thinks we might not need him anymore. The insight took Eleanor's breath away. What makes you think that? Because when people have been hurt really bad, they sometimes think nobody wants them anymore, even when that's not true. Daddy got hurt when Mama died, and then he got hurt again when he had to go to prison. But we still want him. That evening, Elena made 2 important phone calls. The first was to Samuel's attorney, expressing her support for his parole application and offering to provide whatever documentation was needed regarding the children's well-being and desire for their father's return. The second call was to Bernadette Martinez, who had become not just a friend, but a trusted advisor on matters involving the twins. They're ready for him to come home, Elena told her, and honestly, I think he's ready too, even though he's scared. The question is whether the system is ready to recognize genuine rehabilitation when it sees it. Bernadette had been following Samuel's case through her contacts in the federal system, and the reports were consistently positive. Prison officials, educators, and counselors all described a man who had used his incarceration as an opportunity for genuine transformation. The parole board will want to see evidence of community support and a stable reintegration plan, Bernadette said. Have you thought about what that would look like practically? Elena had indeed been thinking about it. Her house was large enough to accommodate Samuel's residence, at least initially. Her nursing practice was well established and could provide financial stability during his transition. Most importantly, the children's emotional needs were being met, which meant any changes could be implemented gradually and thoughtfully. 6 months later, Samuel Blackwood walked out of ADX Florence into a Colorado morning that looked remarkably similar to the one when he'd first been imprisoned. Elena and the twins were waiting for him, along with Bernadette, who had driven down from Denver to witness this moment of redemption. The parole board had been unanimous in their decision, influenced by Samuel's extraordinary record of rehabilitation, the unique circumstances of his original crimes, and the overwhelming evidence that his reintegration would benefit rather than harm his children. Samuel's first words as a free man were directed to his children. I promise you that from now on, we solve problems together as a family. No more secrets, no more running, no more trying to protect you by keeping you in the dark. Emma hugged her father tightly. We promise too, Daddy. We promise to help you remember that you don't have to carry everything by yourself anymore. As they drove toward Albuquerque and the beginning of their new life together, Samuel reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. His crimes had destroyed one version of their family, but they had also ultimately led to something stronger and more honest than what they'd had before. The road ahead wouldn't be simple. Samuel would need to find work as a convicted felon, navigate the complexities of co-parenting with Elena, and help his children integrate their love for him with their understanding of his past mistakes. But for the first time in 8 years, he faced the future without fear, surrounded by people who loved him, not despite his flaws, but with full knowledge and acceptance of everything he'd been and everything he was becoming. The Silverbrook Mine, where this story began, had been permanently sealed by the state of Colorado, deemed too dangerous for public access. But sometimes, late at night when the wind was right, locals claimed they could still hear echoes from the depths, not cries of distress, but something that sounded almost like laughter, as if the mountain itself was celebrating the miracle of love surviving in the darkest places. 3 years after Samuel's release, the Martinez-Blackwood household had settled into a rhythm that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days when federal agents were hunting a fugitive through the Colorado mountains. Samuel had legally changed his surname back to Martinez, honoring his late wife's family name and symbolically marking his commitment to the new life he was building. The breakfast table at Elena's house had become the heart of their unconventional family. Samuel, now 42, and bearing the quiet dignity of someone who had survived his worst mistakes, presided over morning discussions that ranged from Emma's latest short story to Ethan's engineering projects to Elena's nursing practice updates. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you said about moral complexity in literature," Emma said, cutting into her pancakes with the precise movements she'd inherited from her father. At 13, she had grown into a thoughtful teenager whose writing had begun attracting attention from local literary competitions. "Which conversation?" Samuel asked, genuinely curious. Their discussions about books and ideas had become a cornerstone of his relationship with both children, a way of connecting that transcended the years they'd lost, about how good people can make terrible choices when they're desperate or afraid. "I'm writing a story about a doctor who breaks the law to help patients, and I'm trying to understand the difference between right and wrong versus legal and illegal." Eleanor looked up from packing school lunches, catching Samuel's eye across the table. These moments still amazed her, watching him guide his children through complex moral questions with the wisdom earned from his own failures. "What do you think the difference is?" Samuel asked Emma, employing the Socratic method he'd learned during his prison education program. Emma considered the question seriously. "I think sometimes right and wrong are about what helps people and what hurts them, but legal and illegal are about what society has decided to allow. They don't always match up." "That's a sophisticated observation," Samuel replied, "but it raises another question. Who gets to decide what helps people and what hurts them? If everyone made that decision individually without considering laws or social contracts, what kind of world would we have?" Ethan, now 12 and fascinated by systems and structures, both mechanical and social, joined the conversation. "That's why we have courts and juries, right? So individual people don't have to make those decisions alone." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Exactly. I thought I had to be judge and jury for my own situation. I decided that what I was doing was morally right because it helped my family, and I ignored the broader consequences of my actions." These breakfast conversations were part of Samuel's ongoing commitment to transparency with his children. Rather than hiding his past or sugarcoating his mistakes, he used his experiences as teaching moments, helping Emma and Ethan develop critical thinking skills about ethics, justice, and personal responsibility. The approach was working. Both children were excelling academically and socially, but more importantly, they had developed the kind of moral reasoning that would serve them throughout their lives. Teachers consistently praised their empathy, their ability to see multiple perspectives, and their tendency to consider consequences before acting. Samuel's reintegration into society had been challenging, but ultimately successful. Finding employment as a convicted felon had taken months, but his prison education and skills had eventually landed him a position with a non-profit organization that helped other formerly incarcerated individuals navigate re-entry. The work was meaningful, allowing him to use his experiences to help others avoid the pitfalls he'd encountered. More significantly, Samuel had become an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking at conferences and to legislative committees about the importance of rehabilitation programs and family preservation. His articulate presentations about the circumstances that led to his crimes, combined with the evidence of his successful reintegration, had made him a powerful voice for policy change. "Mr. Martinez," State Senator Patricia Williams had said after one of his presentations to the Colorado legislature, Your story illustrates exactly why we need to look at crime in terms of root causes rather than just punishment. Have you considered running for public office yourself? Samuel had politely declined, but the suggestion reflected how dramatically his public perception had changed. The man, once described in news reports as a dangerous fugitive, was now frequently quoted in articles about successful prisoner rehabilitation and family reunification. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had occurred in Emma and Ethan's relationship with their extended community. Rather than hiding their family history, Elena had encouraged transparency appropriate to their age, helping them understand that their father's past was part of their story but didn't define their future. The result had been unexpected acceptance and support. Emma's English teacher, learning about her family background, had connected her with a mentorship program for young writers from challenging circumstances. Ethan's science teacher had arranged for him to participate in a summer engineering camp, specifically designed for students from non-traditional families. It's remarkable, Dr. Patricia Vega, the family therapist who had worked with them since the early days, observed during one of their quarterly check-ins. Most children from backgrounds involving parental incarceration struggle with shame and secrecy. Emma and Ethan have integrated their father's story in a way that makes them stronger rather than stigmatizing them. The key, Elena believed, had been Samuel's own attitude toward his past. Rather than expressing shame or self-pity, he had modeled accountability and growth. The children had learned to see his imprisonment not as a source of embarrassment, but as evidence that people could change, and that mistakes didn't have to be permanent. This perspective was tested when Emma was 15 and applying for a prestigious summer writing program that required extensive background checks on all family members. The program coordinator called Elena with concerns about Samuel's criminal history. "We're not sure this is the right environment for Emma," the coordinator said carefully. "Some of the other parents might be uncomfortable if they knew about her father's background." Emma had overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. That evening, she approached Samuel in his home office, where he was reviewing case files for his non-profit work. "Dad, I need to tell you something. I don't want to go to that writing program if they don't want me there because of who you used to be." Samuel set down his papers and gave Emma his full attention. "Tell me what happened." After Emma explained the situation, Samuel was quiet for several minutes. Elena appeared in the doorway, having heard the conversation, and the three of them sat together in the office that had become Samuel's sanctuary for his advocacy work. "Emma, I want you to have every opportunity to develop your talents," Samuel said finally. "If my past prevents that, then maybe—" "No," Emma interrupted with a firmness that surprised both adults. "If they can't see that you're a good person now and that I'm proud to be your daughter, then I don't want to be part of their program." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Emma, you don't have to sacrifice opportunities because of—" "It's not a sacrifice," Emma replied. "It's a choice. Dad taught me that our choices define who we are. I choose to be someone who stands by her family." Samuel was speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by his daughter's loyalty and the evidence of how thoroughly she had internalized the values he'd tried to instill. But his response surprised both Emma and Elena. "Actually, I think you should go to the program," he said, "but not by hiding who we are. I think you should write an essay about our family story and submit it as part of your application. If they accept you knowing the full truth, then you'll know you belong there. If they don't, then you'll know you made the right choice to go somewhere else." Emma's essay, titled "The Geography of Forgiveness," became a powerful meditation on family redemption and the difference between a person's worst moment and their truest self. She wrote about finding strength in her father's vulnerability, learning empathy from his mistakes, and understanding justice through the lens of someone who had experienced both sides of the legal system. The essay not only gained her admission to the writing program, but won a statewide high school writing competition. More importantly, it established Emma as a voice for young people dealing with family challenges and helped her realize that her unique perspective was a strength rather than a burden. Ethan's path was different, but equally remarkable. His fascination with systems and problem-solving had evolved into specific interest in prison reform and rehabilitation technology. At 14, he was already designing theoretical improvements to correctional facilities that would better support education and family connection. "I want to build prisons that actually help people instead of just punishing them," he told Samuel during one of their regular father-son walks through the foothills behind Elena's house. Samuel studied his son's serious face, seeing Maria's determination combined with his own analytical mind. "That's ambitious work, Ethan. What makes you think the system can be changed?" "Because you changed," Ethan replied simply. "If one person can transform completely, then maybe the whole system can too. It just needs better design." The conversation reminded Samuel of similar walks with his own father decades earlier, when the world had seemed full of possibilities and problems had seemed solvable through hard work and good intentions. The difference was that Ethan was approaching these challenges with a realistic understanding of how difficult change could be, informed by his family's direct experience with the consequences of both crime and punishment. As Emma and Ethan moved through their teenage years, their relationship with their father continued to deepen and evolve. The weekly family meetings that Elena had instituted years earlier had become forums for discussing everything from household responsibilities to social issues to college planning. "I've been thinking about what I want to study in college," Emma announced during one of these meetings. "I want to double major in creative writing and criminal justice." Elena raised an eyebrow. "That's an unusual combination." "Not really," Emma replied. "Both involve understanding human motivation and telling stories about why people make the choices they do. I think I want to be a writer who specializes in stories about justice and redemption." Samuel felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The mixture of pride and worry that seemed to define parenthood. "Are you sure you want to build your career around themes related to our family experience? There are many other subjects you could explore." Emma's answer reflected the thoughtfulness that had characterized her approach to their family situation since childhood. "Dad, our story isn't something that happened to me. It's something that shaped me. I want to use that shaping to help other people understand that everyone deserves the chance to be more than their worst moment." Ethan nodded in agreement. "Emma's right. We didn't choose what happened to our family, but we can choose what we do with what we learned from it." As Samuel looked around the table at Elena, Emma, and Ethan, he realized that the family they had built together was nothing like what he had imagined when he first decided to rob a bank to pay his wife's medical bills. It was better, more honest, more resilient, and more capable of weathering whatever challenges lay ahead. The children had learned to see strength in vulnerability, wisdom in admitting mistakes, and hope in the possibility of transformation. Elena had discovered that love could create family bonds as strong as biology, and Samuel had learned that redemption wasn't a destination, but a daily choice to be better than he had been the day before. Outside, snow was beginning to fall on the Sandia Mountains, covering the landscape in the kind of pristine white that made everything look new and possible. Inside the house, where a convicted felon had been welcomed home by the family he thought he'd lost forever, 4 people were planning a future built on the understanding that love, properly tended, could indeed be the strongest force in the world. The courtroom in downtown Denver was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating arranged in the hallway outside. Emma Martinez, now 18 and preparing for her freshman year at Northwestern University, sat in the front row beside her father, watching as the final defendants in the Meridian financial case received their sentences. It had taken 8 years for the full scope of the corporate conspiracy to be unraveled, but the investigation that began with Samuel's stolen documents had ultimately resulted in convictions for 37 individuals across 6 states. The CEO of Meridian Financial, Marcus Wellington, was facing 25 years in federal prison, a sentence longer than what Samuel had originally been given for the bank robberies that exposed the entire scheme. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Patricia Morrison said, as she prepared to deliver Wellington's sentence, this case represents one of the most extensive healthcare fraud conspiracies in federal history. The defendants systematically targeted vulnerable rural communities, exploiting medical debt to acquire valuable real estate while leaving families devastated and communities without essential healthcare services. Emma watched her father's face as the judge continued. Samuel sat perfectly still, but she could see the tightness around his eyes that indicated he was processing deep emotions. This moment represented a kind of vindication that he'd never expected to witness. However, Judge Morrison continued, this court also recognizes that justice in this case was only possible because of the courage of individuals who risked everything to expose these crimes. The evidence provided by Samuel Martinez himself, a defendant who acknowledged his own wrongdoing while cooperating fully with federal investigators, was instrumental in protecting countless other families from similar exploitation. The judge's words carried special weight because Judge Morrison had been one of the most vocal critics of Samuel's original sentencing, arguing that bank robbery deserved harsh punishment regardless of circumstances. Her public acknowledgement of his contribution to the broader case represented a dramatic shift in perspective. After the sentencing, Samuel, Emma, Ethan, and Elena were approached by federal prosecutor Amanda Chen, who had taken over the Meridian case from the original prosecution team. Mr. Martinez, I wanted to thank you personally, Chen said. Your cooperation has led to the recovery of over $200 million in fraudulent profits, which is being distributed to affected families and communities. More importantly, the regulatory changes resulting from this case will prevent similar schemes from devastating rural healthcare systems. Samuel shook her hand, but his response was characteristically focused on others rather than himself. Prosecutor Chen, I hope this case helps people understand that crime often has root causes that need to be addressed. If we'd had better support systems for families facing medical bankruptcy, none of this might have been necessary. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Actually, that brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you. The Department of Justice is developing new programs for early intervention in medical debt cases, and we'd like your input on the design. Would you be interested in consulting on the project? The offer represented another step in Samuel's unlikely transformation from federal fugitive to policy advisor. Over the past few years, his combination of lived experience and academic credentials had made him a sought-after voice in criminal justice reform circles. But Emma noticed her father's hesitation. What concerns do you have, Dad? Samuel looked at his daughter with the pride that never seemed to diminish, no matter how many times she demonstrated her insight and maturity. I worry about becoming too focused on my own story instead of the broader issues. There are thousands of families affected by medical debt who never resorted to crime. Their voices matter more than mine. This response exemplified the approach Samuel had taken to his advocacy work, always centering the experiences of others while using his own story only when it served a larger purpose. It was a delicate balance that had earned him respect across the political spectrum, Elena, who had been listening to the conversation while keeping an eye on Ethan's interaction with some of the victim families, stepped forward. Samuel, maybe the question isn't whether your story matters most, but whether your platform can amplify other voices that might not otherwise be heard. The suggestion resonated immediately. Rather than serving as the primary spokesperson for medical debt reform, Samuel could use his visibility to highlight the experiences of families who had found legal ways to address their crises, creating a more complete narrative about solutions and resilience. Meanwhile, Ethan had struck up a conversation with Dr. Margaret Santos, a rural physician whose hospital had been one of Meridian's targets. At 16, Ethan possessed an unusual combination of technical knowledge and emotional intelligence that made him an effective bridge between different perspectives. Dr. Santos was telling me about the engineering challenges in rural healthcare. Delivery, Ethan told the family as they prepared to leave the courthouse. She thinks some of the solutions I've been working on for prison communication systems could be adapted for telemedicine in underserved areas. This was typical of Ethan's approach to problem solving. He saw connections between seemingly unrelated systems and found ways to transfer innovations across different contexts. His senior project for high school involved designing a modular communication system that could be rapidly deployed in prisons, rural hospitals, or disaster relief situations. Would you be interested in spending part of your summer working with our rural health initiative? Dr. Santos asked Ethan. We're always looking for young engineers who understand the human side of technical challenges. Ethan's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm that appeared whenever he encountered a new problem to solve. Could I work on projects that help families stay connected during medical crises? That's something I know a lot about. As the family drove back to Albuquerque that evening, Emma reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that morning when Bernadette had found them in the abandoned mine. The four of them were now part of an extended network of people working on various aspects of social justice, healthcare reform, and family support. Dad, Emma said as they crossed into New Mexico, I've been thinking about my college thesis project. I want to write a book about families affected by medical debt, but I want to focus on the ones who found legal solutions rather than the dramatic cases like ours. Samuel glanced at her in the rearview mirror. What's your hypothesis? That resilience and resourcefulness exist in every community, but they're not always visible because they don't generate news stories or criminal cases. I think there are lessons in those quiet success stories that could help prevent other families from reaching crisis points. Elena smiled from the passenger seat. That sounds like a project that could make a real difference. Emma's book project had grown out of her work with a college mentorship program that connected her with families across the Southwest who were dealing with various forms of economic hardship. Rather than interviewing them as subjects, she had developed relationships with them as collaborators, helping to tell their stories in their own voices. The approach had taught her something important about the difference between advocacy and exploitation. True advocacy required listening more than speaking, supporting others' agency rather than replacing it with her own voice. Ethan's work had taken a different but equally impactful direction. His engineering projects had caught the attention of several major technology companies, but he had chosen to focus on open-source solutions that could be implemented by non-profit organizations, rather than proprietary systems that would generate profit. I want to build things that help people connect with each other during difficult times, he'd explained to a recruiter from a major tech company who was puzzled by his lack of interest in their job offer. Connection is what got our family. Through our worst period, I want to make that kind of connection available to other families. Both Emma and Ethan had been shaped by their unusual childhood in ways that made them natural advocates for others facing systemic challenges. But they had also developed the analytical skills and emotional intelligence necessary to be effective advocates rather than simply passionate ones. Their approaches differed significantly. Emma worked through storytelling and narrative while Ethan focused on systems and infrastructure. But both were driven by the same core understanding that individual problems often reflected broader social issues that required collective solutions. Samuel's own work had evolved to focus on policy rather than direct service. His position with the nonprofit had expanded to include research and legislative advocacy, and he had become a regular presence at state and federal hearings on criminal justice reform. But perhaps his most important contribution was his work with other formerly incarcerated parents, helping them navigate the complex process of rebuilding relationships with their children. The support group he facilitated had grown from 3 participants to over 40, meeting weekly to discuss challenges ranging from legal custody issues to emotional healing. The hardest part isn't convincing the system that you've changed. Samuel often told new group members, it's convincing yourself that you deserve forgiveness and that your children deserve to have you back in their lives in a healthy way. Elena's role in their extended advocacy work was different but equally crucial. As a nurse practitioner, she provided medical expertise for policy discussions, but more importantly, she offered a perspective on how healthcare systems could better support families in crisis before they reached desperate situations. Her work had led to the development of new protocols for hospitals treating patients with significant medical debt, including mandatory social work consultations and connections to legal aid services. The protocols were being pilot tested in rural hospitals across 3 states, with promising early results. The evening of the Meridian sentencing, the family gathered for their weekly meeting, a tradition they had maintained even as Emma and Ethan had become busy teenagers with extensive commitments outside the home. I want to talk about something that's been on my mind, Samuel said, as they settled around the kitchen table that had witnessed so many of these conversations over the years. Next year, Emma will be in college, and Ethan will be starting his senior year of high school. Our family structure is going to change significantly. Emma and Ethan exchanged glances. They had been anticipating this conversation, knowing that their father was struggling with the approaching transition. Dad, are you worried that we won't stay connected when we're not all living in the same house? Emma asked gently. Samuel's expression confirmed her guess. I lost so many years with you both. The idea of being separated again, even for good, reasons like education and growth, is difficult for me. Elena reached across the table to take Samuel's hand. Samuel, look at what we've built together. This family isn't held together by physical proximity. It's held together by shared values, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Those things don't disappear when someone goes to college. Ethan leaned forward with the earnestness that characterized his approach to important conversations. Dad, you taught us that love isn't about holding on so tightly that you prevent growth. It's about supporting each other's development, even when that means accepting change. Emma nodded in agreement. Besides, we're not scattering to random places. I chose Northwestern partly because their journalism program has a strong focus on social justice reporting. Ethan's looking at engineering programs that emphasize humanitarian applications. We're carrying forward what we learned here. Samuel looked around the table at his family, realizing that his fear of separation was actually evidence of how successfully they had bonded. The anxiety he felt about Emma leaving for college was the same anxiety experienced by millions of parents whose children had never been endangered or separated by circumstances beyond their control. You're right, he said finally. "I think I'm conflating normal parental worry with trauma from our past experiences. Thank you for helping me see the difference." Elena smiled. "Samuel, the fact that you're experiencing normal parental anxiety is actually a sign of how healthy our family has become. You get to worry about regular things now instead of life and death situations." As they concluded their family meeting and began preparing for bedtime, Emma lingered in the kitchen with Samuel while Eleanor and Ethan headed upstairs. "Dad, I want you to know that everything I'm doing in college and beyond is built on what you taught me during those years when it was just the three of us," she said quietly. "You might have made mistakes, but you also raised me to be someone who cares about justice and truth and protecting people who can't protect themselves." Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with overwhelming gratitude. "Emma, you and Ethan turned out to be remarkable people despite my failures." "Not because of them," Emma shook her head. "No, Dad. We turned out to be remarkable people because you loved us enough to admit your failures and work to be better. That's the most important lesson anyone can learn." As Samuel turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs to the home he shared with his family, he reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. 8 years earlier, he had been a desperate man, making increasingly destructive choices in a futile attempt to control circumstances beyond his power. Now he was surrounded by people who had chosen to love him, not despite his flaws, but with full knowledge of them, and who had helped him transform those flaws into wisdom that could benefit others facing similar challenges. The abandoned mine, where this story began, remained sealed, but its legacy lived on in 4 people who had learned that the deepest darkness could be survived if you refused to let go of each other, and if you maintained faith that morning would eventually come. 10 years had passed since Emma Martinez graduated from Northwestern University with her groundbreaking book, Quiet Heroes, Stories of Medical Debt Survival, becoming a bestseller that influenced national healthcare policy. Now 28, she stood before the Colorado legislature as the state's newly appointed Director of Family Crisis Prevention, presenting her comprehensive reform proposal to a packed hearing room. "Honorable legislators," Emma began, her voice carrying the same measured authority that had characterized her father's advocacy work, "we have an opportunity to become the first state in the nation to implement predictive intervention systems that identify and support families before medical crises lead to financial devastation." In the audience, Samuel sat beside Elena, both now in their 50s and serving as advisors to Emma's new state agency. Samuel's hair had gone completely grey, but his eyes held a peace that had been absent during his years as a fugitive. Elena's nursing practice had evolved into a consultancy focused on rural healthcare access, making her an integral part of Emma's policy team. Ethan, now 26 and holding dual degrees in engineering and public policy from MIT, sat in the legislative gallery beside his wife, Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatrician he'd met during his volunteer work at a children's hospital. Their 2-year-old daughter, Maria Elena Martinez Kim, slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, named after the grandmother she would never meet, but whose love continued to ripple through generations. "The system we're proposing," Emma continued, "combines early warning algorithms that identify families at risk of medical bankruptcy with immediate intervention teams that can provide legal aid, financial counseling, and healthcare navigation before desperation sets in." Senator Patricia Williams, now in her 3rd term and a longtime supporter of the Martinez family's advocacy work, leaned forward with interest. "Director Martinez, this sounds like a significant departure from our current reactive approach to family crisis intervention. What evidence do we have that predictive systems can be effective?" Emma clicked to her next slide, displaying data from pilot programs in 3 Colorado counties. Senator Williams, over the past 2 years, our pilot programs have identified and successfully supported 847 families before they reached crisis situations. The cost of early intervention averages $2,300 per family, compared to $23,000 per family for crisis response after financial or legal problems have already occurred. The numbers represented more than statistics to Emma. They represented families who would never experience the desperation that had driven her father to crime. Children who would never wake up in abandoned mines, wondering if their parents were coming back. Bernadette Martinez, now 58, and serving as Colorado's Deputy Director of Child Welfare Services, rose to provide supporting testimony. The years had been kind to her, bringing promotion and recognition for her innovative approaches to family preservation, but she was still the same compassionate advocate who had descended into the Silverbrook mine 20 years earlier. I want to speak briefly about the long-term perspective on this proposal, Bernadette said, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of experience. 20 years ago, I encountered a family destroyed by the exact circumstances this legislation is designed to prevent. That encounter changed not only my career, but my understanding of how individual trauma connects to systemic failure. She paused, making eye contact with Samuel in the audience. The family I'm referring to is well known to this body, Samuel Martinez and his children, who are now leading this reform effort. But what's important to understand is that their story could have been prevented with the systems Director Martinez is proposing today. The hearing room was completely silent as Bernadette continued. Samuel Martinez robbed banks not because he was inherently criminal, but because he saw no legal pathway to save his children after his wife's medical debt destroyed their financial stability. His daughter Emma is now preventing other families from facing that same impossible choice. This is what successful rehabilitation and family healing looks like, not just personal recovery, but contribution to systemic change that protects others. After the hearing concluded with unanimous committee approval, the extended Martinez family gathered at Elena's house for their traditional post-testimony dinner. The kitchen table that had witnessed so many family meetings over the years was now expanded to accommodate 3 generations, with little Maria's high chair positioned where she could see all the adults who comprised her world. Mama Emma, will the new law help other daddies not have to go away? Asked 6-year-old Diego Santos, Elena's newly adopted son, whose own father was currently serving time for drug-related offenses. Elena had continued her pattern of providing homes for children separated from their parents, creating an ever-expanding definition of family. Emma knelt beside Diego's chair, choosing her words carefully. The law will help families get the support they need before parents feel like they have to make dangerous choices. But Diego, even when parents do make mistakes, it doesn't mean they stop loving their children or that the children did anything wrong. Samuel, now called Abuelo Sam by the youngest generation, lifted Diego onto his lap. The most important thing to remember is that families can heal and grow stronger, even after difficult times. Look around this table. We're all here because we learned that love is more powerful than any problem we might face. The conversation that followed covered familiar themes, but with new perspectives shaped by the family's evolution over 2 decades. Emma and Ethan, now parents themselves, understood their father's desperation in ways they couldn't as children. Samuel and Elena, watching their children raise the next generation, marveled at how trauma could be transformed into wisdom across generations. I've been thinking about writing a follow-up book, Emma said, as they lingered over dessert. Something about how families affected by incarceration can break cycles of trauma rather than perpetuating them. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to contribute a chapter about designing systems that support family connection during incarceration. The communication technology I've been developing is being implemented in 12 states now, but there's still so much more we could do. Sarah, who had brought a physician's perspective to their family discussions since marrying into the Martinez clan, offered her own insight. From a pediatric standpoint, I see how children's resilience is directly connected to their sense of being unconditionally loved. Emma and Ethan are proof that even chaotic circumstances can't damage that foundation if it's strong enough. Elena, now serving as the unofficial family historian, pulled out a photo album she'd been compiling over the years. The images told the story of their unlikely family's evolution, from the early hospital photos of two frightened children to recent pictures of Emma receiving her appointment as state director, Ethan's wedding, and multiple generations gathered around holiday tables. "Look at this progression," Elena said, pointing to photos spanning 20 years. "From crisis to stability to contribution to legacy. This is what healing looks like across time." Samuel studied the photographs, particularly one taken during his first Christmas after release from prison. In the image, he was reading to Emma and Ethan beside Elena's Christmas tree, all three wearing matching pajamas Elena had insisted upon. The man in that photograph looked tentative, unsure of his place in the family constellation. "I was so afraid that first year," Samuel admitted. "Afraid that I didn't deserve to be part of your lives again. Afraid that I would somehow contaminate the stability Elena had created for you." Emma reached across the table to squeeze her father's hand. "Dad, you taught me something crucial during those early years, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. You were afraid, but you showed up anyway, day after day until the fear faded and love took its place." As the evening wound down and the various family members prepared to return to their own homes, Samuel found himself alone in Elena's garden. The same space where he'd once walked with his children during those tentative early years of reintegration. The mountains visible in the distance reminded him of the Colorado peaks where this story had begun, where two small children had waited, in darkness for a father who almost didn't make it back to them. The landscape hadn't changed, but everything else had been transformed by choices made in love rather than desperation. Elena joined him in the garden, carrying 2 cups of tea and settling beside him on the bench they'd installed years earlier. During one of their family workdays, "What are you thinking about?" she asked, though she could probably guess. 20 years ago, I thought love meant protecting Emma and Ethan from every hardship, even if it destroyed me in the process," Samuel replied. "I never imagined that the greatest gift I could give them was learning to accept help, to be vulnerable, to show them that adults could make mistakes and still be worthy of love." Elena smiled, thinking of all the children who had passed through her home over the years, each one teaching her something new about resilience and healing. "Samuel, you gave them something even more valuable than protection. You gave them a model of genuine redemption. They've watched you transform your worst choices into contributions that help others. That's a gift they'll carry forward for generations." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared in the garden with little Maria, who had woken from her nap and wanted to see the flowers before going home. "Abuelo Sam, tell Maria the story about the mountain flowers," Emma said, settling on the grass with her daughter while Samuel and Elena watched from the bench. Samuel lifted Maria onto his lap, pointing to the wildflowers Elena had planted throughout the garden. "Once upon a time, there was a mountain where beautiful flowers grew, but they could only bloom after surviving the coldest, darkest winter." Emma listened to her father tell their family story, transformed into a fairy tale, watching her daughter's face light up with wonder at the tale of flowers that became stronger and more beautiful because of the hardships they survived rather than despite them. Later that night, as Emma tucked Maria into bed in their own home across town, the little girl asked the question that would carry their family story into its next generation. "Mama, Will I be a strong flower like Abuelo Sam? And you and Uncle Ethan? Emma kissed her daughter's forehead, seeing in her face the same determination that had carried their family through their darkest moments. Yes, baby. You come from a long line of people who learned that love is stronger than fear, that families can heal from anything, and that our hardest experiences can become our greatest gifts to the world. As Emma turned off the bedroom light, she could see through the window the lights of Albuquerque spread out below, each one representing a family with their own struggles, their own love, their own potential for transformation. Somewhere in those lights were families currently facing the same desperation that had once driven her father to crime. But now, thanks to the system she and her family had helped create, those families would find support instead of isolation, legal pathways instead of desperate choices, hope instead of despair. The abandoned mine where their story began had been transformed into a memorial garden with a plaque dedicated to families affected by medical debt and a commitment that no family would face such crises alone. The inscription, written by Emma and approved by the state of Colorado, read simply, "Love survives the deepest darkness when we refuse to let go of each other." 21 years after Bernadette Martinez first heard children crying in an abandoned mine, those same children had grown into adults whose life's work was ensuring that no other family would face the impossible choices that had nearly destroyed them. The mine was sealed, but the love that had sustained two small children in that darkness had opened pathways to healing that would protect thousands of families for generations to come. In the end, Samuel Blackwood's greatest crime had been believing he had to face his family's crisis alone. His greatest redemption was learning to accept that love multiplied when shared, that healing was possible at any stage of life, and that the most powerful legacy anyone could leave was the knowledge that no one has to carry their burdens in isolation. The story that began with half-frozen twins in an abandoned mine had become a testament to the possibility of transformation, the power of unconditional love, and the truth that our worst moments don't have to define our ultimate destination. Sometimes the longest journey is the one that leads us home to ourselves and to the people who choose to love us, not despite our flaws, but with full knowledge of them. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, that journey home becomes a pathway that others can follow toward their own healing, their own redemption, and their own understanding that love, properly tended, can indeed survive anything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.